because I've literally spent 10 minutes talking about this whiskey. Fortunately, I've not opened it and done the sampling, otherwise I would be even more pissed off. So, let's start again. I can't remember what I was talking about. Yes, number 4. Right, so far we've done a single malt Scotch, we've done a bourbon, and we've done a blended malt. So essentially the one that's left over, particularly in terms of Scotch whisky, is a blended whisky. So single malt, malted barley, distilled, single malt whisky from a single distillery. Blended malt is a blend of malt whiskies, just malt whiskies from various distilleries blended together. Blended whisky is a blending of single malt whiskies and grain whisky. Talked about this yesterday, but just in case you haven't seen it, grain whisky, very cheap, very easy to make. It's a constant process. You get lots of whisky as a result of it, but it doesn't taste particularly brilliant. It's quite harsh. It's quite raw. So what blended whisky will do is take the grain as the bulk of the whisky and kind of use it as filler, and then bring in single malts to give you some flavour, and basically sort of balance it out and make it much more palatable. Now, in 1887, a guy called William Grant set up a business and also opened a distillery that you may have heard of called Glenfiddich in Speyside. Now, he also managed to acquire a load of stock of whiskies when a local whisky distributor went bust, and basically set up a business as a whisky distributor himself. Now, at the time, at the turn of the century, blended whiskies were very big, and he used Glenfiddich along with grain whiskies to create a blended whisky that was called Grant's. And in 1902, his son-in-law went across to the Far East in Australia and spent a year out there basically punting it around, and it worked because it created demand for their whisky overseas. Now, if you ask somebody in the UK what's the biggest selling blended whisky, most people will probably say Bell's or Grouse. They might say Grant's, maybe third or fourth on the list. Grant's is actually, and there we go, Grant's is the third biggest selling blended whisky in the world. Now the top 2, probably not what you would think, because we're talking about the world here. Number 1 is Johnnie Walker Red Label, and number 2 is Ballantine's. Now Ballantine's is quite hard to find in the UK because it's so big in the rest of the world, particularly in mainland Europe. So it just gets shipped out there. So William Grant and Sons, basically the company, they opened their own distillery in Girvan just to make grain whisky, and it's at the moment it's the second biggest producer of grain whisky in the world. Now they need that amount of grain whisky because Grant's is such a big seller around the world that they need that production level. They own as a company 4 distilleries. They own Glenfiddich and Balvenie, which are 2 really big single malt companies. You've probably heard of Balvenie, no doubt you've heard of Glenfiddich. They own another one called Kinninvie, which was opened in 1990 and basically just produces the single malts to go into the blend. There's a couple of very hard to get hold of single malt releases called Hazelwood, but they just produce single malt whisky to go into the blends because it's such a big seller. And they recently opened another one called Ailsa Bay in 2007, which is in Girvan by the Grain Distillery. It's not released anything yet, and again, probably going to go into Grant's just because the demand's there. So, what we're looking for here is we're looking for a really good balance, because what blended whiskies are trying to do is give you something easy drinking. In the main, blended whiskies I'm talking about, giving you something easy drinking, but because of the cost of production, because you've got this kind of grain whisky as the bulking it out and keeping the cost down, it's going to make it much more mainstream and much easier to drink for everybody to get hold of. A 70cl bottle of this, you're looking at about 15 quid, maybe a bit less on the deal, but you're trying to get as many people to drink it as possible. So it has to be a balance. Now, the difficult thing about blended whiskies is consistency, because you have to take single malts from various places, and it's more than likely the Grants are using single malt whiskies not just from Glenfiddich and Balvenie. They're getting it from somewhere else, but they're not going to want it known. But you're getting the stock from various places, and you're making whiskey year after year after year, and sometimes it changes, and sometimes you have issues, and sometimes you have stock issues, and you still have to keep the consistency of your mainstream brand that is selling absolutely bucket loads, and it has to taste the same over and over and over again. And the guys that are involved in the whole blending process, the guys that are smelling all these various samples and tasting and going, yes, that's the one, no, don't use that one, no, that's different, because it's all about consistency. So The label has changed. This is a miniature that's a little bit older, but it should. I'm fairly confident this is going to taste exactly the same as if I went down this road to the shop, although it's shut now. But if I went down the road to the shop and picked up a bottle of Grants, it would taste exactly the same as this. Because when it's selling that many bottles, millions, billions across the world, they can't afford to go suddenly wacko one year and go, do you know what, we're going to make it a lot sweeter. Oh, we're going to put loads of other whiskies in and make it a lot smokier. They can't afford to do that. So it's all about consistency. So I don't think I've ever had this, and yet this is such a big brand. Probably because I turned my nose up at it, but the challenge is there, and I need to try this 366. So it's quite light, quite fruity as well. Actually, it's not too rich. It's quite delicate, but there's there's almost like pear, weirdly. Yeah, it's kind of apple and pear and quite light. Not too full on, not very rich, but there is a sweetness there. Now you can definitely get that grainy feel. There's this, it's not rough, rough's the wrong word, but there is definitely a prickliness that's not alcohol. It's slightly drying, and that's the effect of the grain whiskies that are in there. And you'll find that when you're drinking blended whiskies, if you did a direct comparison of a single malt to a blend, a generic blend, you'd find that the single malt will have a bit more depth and a bit more richness overall than a blended whiskey would. And I'm talking about not kind of experimental blended whiskies or more expensive ones, or if you were to put bog standard single malt next to a bog standard blend, you would definitely be able to tell the difference because of the grain whiskies that are in there. Having said that, it's not offensive, it's not harsh. There is a very pleasant sweetness to it. It does last. It dies off a little bit quickly, but I would kind of expect that. But it's actually very pleasant. Now, they actually talk about using this on their website about cocktails and long drinks and put ice in it. And don't get me started on ice with whiskey. We'll talk about that at a later date. But they're really sort of pushing this as in, don't just drink this neat, stick this in cocktails or anything like that. And I don't have a problem with using something like this in cocktails. I would rather not use quite an expensive single malt, depending on what you need. But on its own, it's nice and warming. There is a nice fruitiness in it. For 15 quid, to be honest, you really can't go wrong. And I am not surprised at all that this is one of the biggest selling blends in the world, because it ticks all the boxes that you would want if you're a whiskey drinker. It's got a nice sweetness to it. It's dead easy to drink. It's nothing challenging. It's very, very pleasant indeed. Can't really argue with it. It's it's absolutely fine. So yeah, well done, Grants. You've actually surprised me. It's not one to poo-poo. It's very pleasant, very nice. Does exactly what they're attempting to do, and it's good stuff. So yeah, that's one blended whiskey off. I'm now going to start looking at maybe trying to do a run of tastings where they're all on a similar theme. But yeah, nice one. 4 down.